So he's currently professor at Rivera Presto Medical School and is an accredited advisor in the postgraduate program in mental health of the I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing this correctly. Apologies. Rivero Preto Medical School. He is also a researcher in the National Institute of Science and Technology, Translational Medicine, and in the Cannabinoid Research Center, and a co-coordinator of the Laboratory for Studies on Psychedelic Hallucinogens in Mental Health from the Department of Neurosciences and Behavior. He has experience in the field of pharmacology with an emphasis on psychopharmacology, acting mainly on the following topics: psychoactive drugs, hallucinogens, cannabinoids, serotonin, glutamate, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, substance-related disorders, and mental health. Dr. Dos Santos has more than 100 publications on hallucinogens and cannabinoids, with more than 60 of these publications on ayahuasca. Friends, without further ado, Dr. Rafael Dos Santos.
Thank you, Verna, for the presentation and the introduction. Thank you all for the invitation and for being here. I'll share my screen. If you have any problem, please just tell me if you not see it. Is that okay? Everyone can see it? Can I begin?
Okay. Yes, we can.
So I'll be talking with you today about ayahuasca. I have no conflicts of interest. I am a professor at the Department of Neuroscience and Behavior in São Paulo University in Brazil, and the coordinator of our services, psychiatry investigation services with psychedelics or hallucinogen compounds. So there is no industry or pharmaceutical group involved in our research with ayahuasca. And this is the outline. I'll be talking about pharmacological, general aspects, history of ayahuasca, legal aspects too, the traditional uses, and then the effects of ayahuasca, the results of experimental, observational, and also some clinical trials that we are developing here in Brazil. And in the final part of the talk about some possible mechanisms of action of ayahuasca and its compounds. So what is ayahuasca? It's used for ritual and therapeutic purposes by several indigenous groups spread to South America, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador. This is a personal picture I took in a congress that we went in the north of Brazil. There were the presence of indigenous communities too. And these uses are legal in ritual uses. This is legal in Brazil, Colombia, Peru. Ayahuasca is not scheduled in any of those countries. In Brazil, it occurred a very peculiar phenomenon that in the 30s, some immigrants from other Brazilian states went to the Amazon, northern Brazil, and got in touch with these indigenous groups that used ayahuasca, and after that created syncretic religious groups that blend elements of Christianity, Afro-Brazilian elements, and indigenous elements, such as the Santo Daime, is maybe the most famous one internationally, União do Vegetal, or Union of the Plants, and Barquinho, or Little Boat. In the 70s, they started to spread to Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, the bigger cities in Brazil, and in the early 90s already some groups are starting to go to Spain, the Netherlands, and also the US. Currently, this number is probably higher. More than 20 countries there are these groups, and more than 20,000 ritual users using ayahuasca, at least in Brazil, bi-weekly. Every two times a month, people use ayahuasca, mostly in these three religious groups, Santo Daime, União do Vegetal, Barquinha, but today we have several derivations and ramifications of these groups. And in the picture we see the Santo Daime. They use special clothes. There's a special way to organize people in the ritual. They chant. So if you want to know more about this cultural aspect, we can talk about the end of the talk. It's made basically by the main plant, this ayahuasca, this word comes from the Quechua, which means aya, spirit or dead, and huasca, vine or liana. So it could be like the liana of the spirits, the rope of the spiritual world. So the liana is the main plant, which you see here is Banisteriopsis caapi. But different indigenous groups mix dozens of other plants together with the vine. One of those plants, which is basically used mostly in Brazil and Peru, is Psychotria viridis, which the picture you can see there. It's from the coffee family, Rubiaceae, and it is rich in DMT, which I'll talking later. But in Colombia, for example, they use other plants, Diplopteris cabrerana, which also is rich in DMT and is also a liana, but they use the leaves of this plant. And in Brazil, for instance, ayahuasca can only be produced by using Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis, for example. Ayahuasca is prepared depending on the indigenous group, depending of the religious group. They have these different recipes, but basically it's a prolonged decoction of the plants, depending the quantity of how they use it differs between groups. And this creates a brownish and bitter beverage that generally the most common use is oral. There are some anthropological reports of other use, like eating parts of the plant, so that's very unusual in Brazil and mostly restricted some indigenous groups. But basically, ayahuasca use it as an oral liquid. The alkaloids, the main alkaloids are the beta-carbolines. Harmine is the main one, that's most present in the Banisteriopsis caapi, but also harmaline and tetrahydroarmine. And in Psychotria viridis and Diplopteris cabrerana, it's DMT or dimethyltryptamine. We can observe that the chemical structure of the compounds is similar, and they share this indolic ring, which is a common structure present in serotonin. So this is a hint of the possible mechanism of action of these drugs. They are all somehow serotonergic modulators. We do not know exactly when, but we know today that ayahuasca only works because these two plants are together. If we ingest Psychotria viridis only with DMT, our peripheral, mainly hepatic and gastrointestinal monoamine oxidase, will degrade DMT, metabolize it, so we won't reach the brain. The indigenous groups discovered by probably intent and error, but we don't know when or how, that when you use the liana, the Banisteriopsis caapi with Psychotria viridis, we know today that beta-carbolines, they inhibit MAO, peripheral MAO, so this allows DMT to reach the brain, where it acts as agonists at 5-HT2A receptors. 5-HT is the chemical abbreviation for serotonin. So we know today that these receptors are expressed in these cortical and limbic areas, and we will talk about that more in the mechanism of action part. So about the law aspects of ayahuasca. It's very curious because some countries, including European countries and sometimes in the US, ayahuasca internationally should not be controlled. We can see that in the 2010 INCB document. No plants are currently controlled by the 71 and 88 conventions, except cannabis, opium, and coca. And any preparation made for plants are not under international control. So officially, ayahuasca should not be controlled anywhere. But because of the presence of DMT in several countries, people are arrested or persecuted because they are having ayahuasca with them. It's a very complicated topic, and we work with some organizations that try to give legal advice to those individuals. In any case, Brazil has a very different legislation because ayahuasca, the ritual and religious use of ayahuasca is allowed anywhere in the country. The indigenous use was never scheduled. So I will talk about more details about the resolution in Brazil. As I told you before, We can only use Banisteriopsis capium Psychotria viridis to prepare ayahuasca. These groups should be self-sufficient, or this means that they should plant their own plants and prepare the ayahuasca using the plants they use there, geographically speaking, because there is the risk of using too much of the plants from the Amazon, and we cannot allow that. There's specific regulation for that. And it's not allowed to be commercialization or tourism, although we know that this sometimes happen. This is most common, especially in Peru, because we know today there are literally hundreds of, how can I say, places where people, especially foreigners from Europe, the US, go there to take ayahuasca in these rituals that we not know exactly who are doing. Sometimes they say it's indigenous or mestizo people, but sometimes there are foreigners that's running the service, so it's a very complicated topic. And as it's a tourism and there is commercialization, sometimes incidents may happen, because in this context, security sometimes put in the second place. So in Brazil, we cannot use ayahuasca as a medicine, as a traditional medicine. It can be only used therapeutically in a religious ritual context, like you go to the church or go to the Buddhist temple and you feel better, you can try to resolve your problems there. But ayahuasca, until today, anywhere in the world, it's permitted as a traditional or drug or medicine. And research in Brazil is allowed and is included, is promoted. That's why we can do what we can do here, for example, using it in clinical trials. So what are the effects of this Amazonian beverage? The first studies to show what could be the possible problems or mental health effects of ayahuasca were observational studies. Researchers go to these churches or religious groups and apply and use, for example, several psychopathological, neuropsychological, cognitive measures to see how these people go in a mental health perspective. Before these studies, there were earlier commissions that went to this country, to the cities in the north of Brazil to evaluate the communities, but it was not a scientific work. But they observed that they were very, like say, normal people living their lives, but they used ayahuasca in their churches. So religious use of ayahuasca over and over the years has not been associated with harm. We can see there's no evidence of mental harm, or personality or psychopathological evidence. There's no evidence that ayahuasca is addictive in any evidence of that. Include evidence should be more, is showing to be on the other way around, more contrary, like possible use as a therapeutic option in drug abuse. And increased spirituality also, which is context dependent, right? After all, this is a religion. But we always observed lower depression and anxiety scores in these ritual users, less use of alcohol, illicit drugs, and some prescription drugs. We are performing now studies in Portugal, in the Netherlands, is already published, in Spain is already published, and we also probably conducting this in Israel too in the following years to evaluate public health outcomes associated with ayahuasca use. So what you're seeing, we already have published in the Netherlands and Spanish sample. These people using ayahuasca, they report increased quality of life, healthier lifestyles. For example, they eat more fruit, less red meat. They practice more sport or meditation or yoga. But this observational studies, is not possible to establish causality. So maybe these people are already this way, and because they are this way, they start to use ayahuasca ritually. But it can also be the other way around. That ayahuasca somehow influences these public health outcomes. But ayahuasca also has side effects, right? This is observational study we did here in Brazil with members of the UDV, União do Vegetal, and they talked, it's a self-report about what they think are the risks associated with ayahuasca. And it's very interesting, as you will see, that they match what we see in clinical trials. So Adverse effects are frequent, especially, let's say, physical ones, but they are most transient on self-limits and low risk. And people basically, they have vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, and sometimes they experience acute and time-limited ayahuasca, anxiety, drowsiness, and restlessness. But most of these effects I will see in clinical trials are restricted to the first 12 hours of after ayahuasca intake. Some of the effects they are prolonged for 24 or 48 hours, but they are mild and self-limited. So this is also what we can see in the clinical trials. But it's interesting to know and to mention that although rare, we do have some instance of more serious side effects, especially in the psychological sphere, let's say like that. The most uh, important of the side effect that also is true for LSD and psilocybin is a psychotic experience. There is a difference between experience psychotic-like effects during the acute effects of these drugs, because that what they do. Some in the psychiatric investigation investigate, for example, similarities between this experience and psychotic experience. They share some, for example, there's some type of grandiosity, perceptual alterations, the velocity of the speed of the thoughts, but people know that ingesting a drug and it's acute and will pass in some hours. This is, and if this is sometimes bad, not a happy experiences, and sometimes with anguish, anxiety, this is called a bad trip because it's restricted to the time of effect of the drug, like 6 hours when the drugs were off. Oh, this was a bad trip. I don't want to take this anymore, but will pass. More or rarer or more rare as people that have prolonged reactions like those, like suggesting the induction of a psychotic disorder. We have some case reports and case series, including, you can see of the first three references in the slide. They are studies from the young religions. They also monitor these episodes. Until today, these episodes are very rare, and we never saw that in any clinical trial. And we think the difference because we have very strict inclusion criteria. So people with family or personal history of psychosis, mania, borderlines are not included. Bipolar patients are not included too. So maybe that's why we do not see that in clinical trials. Also, this does not happen with LSD and psilocybin, but when you go to the population, we need to be more care with some of these restrictions. It's also true, well, as you can see in the table, that many of those cases are young people, sometimes with already hypomania episodes, and that use a lot of drugs together with ayahuasca. And also you can see with smoked DMT, which is not ayahuasca. Ayahuasca has DMT, but ayahuasca is not only DMT. Smoking DMT or vaporizing DMT is very different from taking oral ayahuasca in a ritual context. So as I told you about the commercialization in tourism, and we have, I was commissioned by ICERS. I am in the ICERS Foundation Advisory Board. It's an organization that do more observation studies with ayahuasca and also ibogaine and cannabis users. And over the decades, we documented over 58 cases of deaths possibly related to ayahuasca. But let's take a deeper look in that. Most cases are foreigners that go to Colombia, Peru, and people, we do not know where they went, what they call ayahuasca, or the drugs with ayahuasca, the plant, like brugmansia that has atropine and scopolamine that can be dangerous. How's the mental health or the physical health of these people before they get there? Were they taking 1, 2, or 5 medicines? How was the liver, the brain? We do know nothing about that because there are no forensic data. Most of these cases we found them in the media, so we do not know nothing about them. And there is this pressure of sometimes these are very poor people trying to sell ayahuasca or bringing people to drink, and maybe they are not prepared to deal with some instance that ayahuasca can produce. In any case, there is this huge number of possible 800,000 people that possibly took ayahuasca only in 2019. So even if this number of deaths is true, it's very low compared to the incidence of ayahuasca use worldwide. But we need to be aware and try to understand what happened to those people. So going now to the experimental part of the talk, I went to do my PhD in Barcelona, Spain, with Dr. George Riba, which is the first author of this and other studies. These were the first controlled trials with ayahuasca. Dr. George Riba received ayahuasca from Brazil, freeze-dried, so it was in powder, to put in capsules, and it was easier to mask. To do, for example, a double-blind placebo study, controlled study with ayahuasca. That's what we are seeing in this image. This is the first study that showed that it's a DMT-dependent effect, of a dose-dependent effect of ayahuasca. This is the higher the DMT contents, the more intense, from a especially subjective point of view, the experience is. It can be done safely in young, healthy individuals, no reports of serious adverse effects. And this is the first study that showed the time curve of the effects of ayahuasca. This can be very, it's variable depending of the individual, but more or less we see this effect starting 20 minutes, 30 minutes, usually is when more nausea and vomiting occurs. Then we have a peak around 1-2 hours, and then 3-4 hours, a person already being more in their baseline state, let's say like that. And in clinical trials here, for example, after 5 hours, we give a lunch to volunteers, and if they show they're okay, we can send them home, or using a taxi, Uber, or by another friend or people that is responsible for them. This is still studies in healthy volunteers. The first one, 2007, was my master's project. We saw that a single dose of ayahuasca, 18 milligrams of DMT, produced acute reductions in anxiety in ritual users. These were people that were already using ayahuasca like for 10 years, very used to ayahuasca. And then we replicated that last year with the Giordano master's projects. We gave ayahuasca and cannabidiol to see if they're interacted, but we saw that both drugs, they induce an acute reduction in anxiety measure. Remember that those are healthy volunteers, it's not clinical populations. Also, we have volunteers. We have heard some anecdotal reports of people saying that they get better life of chronic pain conditions after participation in ayahuasca rituals, like to fibromyalgia also. So we are doing this first study to see, we are comparing ayahuasca with esketamine, because we know esketamine already is an approved analgesic. If they, in a hot model, they do not burn the volunteers, but the skin is heated, and they have to say how much time and how much temperature they endure with the tests. So this is a very preliminary study. We plan to do 20 volunteers. We only did 2, but today we have more 6 volunteers. And what we can see here is that although there is no clear effects on the temperature, they seem to endure more time with this temperature, increasing their tolerance to temperature, pain tolerance. We do not know yet. The study is blind. We have to keep the study to find if there is any significant difference between ayahuasca and esketamine. Now, clinical studies. We were the first scientific group in the world to do a clinical trial with ayahuasca. In fact, I don't know how much of you know that in the 60s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, there were clinical studies with psychedelics in the US and Europe, mainly LSD, but also psilocybin. But after this window in the early 70s, the studies were started to be prohibited and controlled. the first studies are only going to appear in 1995. So in this new wave of studies, we were the first to do a clinical trial with patients, even before the psilocybin study with depression. So in this, they are depressed, recurrent depression patients. They were going to change their medication. So to change their medication, they were in a inward for two weeks because they're very how can I say, moderate to intense depression. We were afraid that they could have any problems. So in this window, when they were in the hospital, we gave them a single dose of ayahuasca, open label. No? And what we see here is a very rapid and sustained antidepressant effects. The only drug that had produced that until that point was ketamine in the early 2000s. So, but this is an open label trial, and we need to do that with placebo. So that's what we did some years later. This is the same population, treatment-resistant depression. Again, a single dose of ayahuasca. This time we compare this with, it's not a psychoactive placebo, but it was active because it was planned to induce nausea and some, maybe including one of the volunteers in the placebo group vomited, so it worked somehow. But this, we also replicated the find with the open label trial showing a rapid antidepressant effect of ayahuasca. In 1 week, compared to placebo in this treatment-resistant population, ayahuasca reduced significantly their depressive symptoms. Just after that, doing my postdoc project, we did a clinical trial with people with social anxiety. We have an anxiety model here in the university that people have to talk in front of a television about like the cars or the weather in the city. This is an anxiety producing model in healthy volunteers and also in people with anxiety disorders. So these were, is a small trial, 14 patients with social anxiety disorders. 5 hours, this means after the acute effect of ayahuasca had subsided, they did this test, and what we see here in the graphic compared to a placebo is that this is a self-statement scale. This is how people feel they are doing during their performance, the self-perception. There is no right or wrong in this test. It's how people feel they are performing. So what we see here is that we do not know explain how, but people that took ayahuasca compared to placebo, they felt better during the performance. So somehow this was a pro-cognitive effect of ayahuasca. How this will be translated or someday used clinically, we still don't know. We also just finished this study. We just have submitted the manuscript. It's a reality in the US and also a reality in Brazil that university or university students, they drink sometimes more than they should. It's a social phenomenon here in Brazil. University students, they drink more than the general population. So we thought we could try a single dose of ayahuasca, since there's these observational studies showing that people drink less. Let's see the population that has a lot of alcohol consumption if the ayahuasca reduces it. This is a very small trial, just 11 university studies. These results show that with just single dose of ayahuasca, single blind, only the researchers knew that they were given ayahuasca. The university studies were told that they receive ayahuasca or a psychoactive placebo, but in fact, there was only ayahuasca. And what you can see here is a significant results of alcohol reduction in the last week. I mean, we give ayahuasca in baseline and assessed alcohol use in the following 3 weeks. This is a very small trial, but this is a preliminary good evidence of safety and possible efficacy to do a bigger trial in the near future. Since the study with depression with single dose was published, we started a new study now using 4 weekly doses of ayahuasca compared with 4 weekly doses of oral esketamine. Esketamine is already approved for depression as Spravato, it's intranasal, not oral. We use it orally because it should be the same as ayahuasca to be easier to mask. And we are using ketamine for many reasons. Ethically, because, for example, people with depression, if you give inactive placebo, they can increase their depression symptoms again. So esketamine may have antidepressive and anxiolytic effects. From a blinding point of view, this blinding is a very polemic topic in psychedelic research, because how can you blind such effects with inactive placebo? So we are also use esketamine, which has psychedelic dissociative effects. So both researchers and volunteer, they may like fulfill the expectative that people are taking some psychoactive drug. Since some of these drugs are in the hype, they are in the television, in the newspapers, many people come here to the hospital saying, look, I want to take this drug that people are saying you see a lot of colors and you see your life and get better. So it's a hype and not always truth, but people want to receive some kind of drug. So esketamine can also match this expectative. They can also be psychoactive. So that's why we are using it. And now people can take 4 doses of ayahuasca or 4 doses of ketamine in the study. And what we see here, we are planning to go to 30 volunteers. We already did 15. Here are preliminary data for 12 of them. We can see already preliminary data showing that in both groups, these groups are together, ayahuasca and ketamine, there is a reduction in the depression score and depression severity. We are also doing the first study with ayahuasca for PTSD. There are some anecdotal reports of war veterans from the US that go to Peru, Colombia, and even Brazil to these retreats where they take ayahuasca to try to manage their post-traumatic symptoms. But there is no controlled trial of any of psychedelics. Some studies already started with psilocybin in US and Europe, but they are not published yet. So we are also comparing it with esketamine again for the same ethical and blinding reasons. And we are planning to do 20 patients. We already did 3. This is data from two of them. And we can see in this scale that measure post-traumatic disorder symptoms, reduction. It's just a single dose, and we measured symptoms 1, 2, and 3 weeks later, and we also see a reduction in those symptoms. Let's see if these effects are maintained as the study is going. We also are monitoring the safety of all patients that are participating in all trials. So this data was published in 2022. We already have more actual recent data, which is not shown here, but it's similar to what I'm showing to you. In over 10 years of work in here and of more than 100 ayahuasca administration sessions, until now, we only observed 2, maybe 3 cases where there were psychological adverse reactions, mainly characterized by anxiety, confusion, and dissociation. What happened to these volunteers is a state where the psychoactive effects of ayahuasca are overwhelming. People get confused sometimes with fear. Will this effect pass? Will I have medication? But in all cases, only verbal environmental management, like talking low, explain that you remember that you ingested the drug that has some time-specific effects, this will pass. Just verbal management. We never had to give medication or rescue medication to any of our patients. And this is all reflected in the literature with psilocybin and LSD. Until now, in the last 20 years, there is only one case in a study of LSD that they used high LSD doses, and one volunteer experienced anxiety and psychotic symptoms that were managed with an anxiolytic and psychotic drug, but also resolved. So when you do a good screening and a good psychological support in these trials, most people won't have serious adverse effects, but they are here to remember that they can and they do happen. So the final part of the talk will be about mechanism. I was told that maybe this could be some of the most interesting part of the talk. Some of you that work with pharmacology, so I hope you enjoy it. I could just end this talk saying that we do not know how ayahuasca works, but let's put some color on that. Biological mechanisms. We know today, basically with studies with LSD, psilocybin, and also ayahuasca, with neuroimage studies, especially using functional magnet resonance, that ayahuasca and DMT and other these drugs modulate what we call the default mode network, which is this group of brain regions involved in process like introspection, uh, interoception, self-assessment, consciousness, and emotional processing. We know today that these brain areas like prefrontal cortex, posterior anterior cingulate cortex, and some limbic regions, they are rich, as I told you before, in 5-HT2A receptors, which we know today from preclinical and also human studies, that they are the main target for the subjective effects of these drugs, not necessarily therapeutic effects. This is another discussion. But in any case, we show here neuroimage study with ayahuasca showing that it decreases activity and connectivity in the default mode network. It's very interesting because in depression, for instance, the default mode network is hyperactive. It's associated with rumination, people having negative thoughts about themselves and the world constantly. And one possible explanation is that the psychedelics would relax this rigid form of thinking and allow, for example, neuroplasticity and behavior change. Associated with that, we know, for example, that in depression, some patients, they have low levels of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a neurotrophic factor involved in, for example, synaptogenesis, increasing brain plasticity. The antidepressant effects of ketamine, some studies show they are associated, for example, increased BDNF levels. We also show that with ayahuasca. What you are seeing here is that the low BDNF levels of these patients was normalized compared to controls 2 days after a single ayahuasca dose. And these effects are also modulated by cortisol, which is a hormone associated with stress, but also involves somehow the mechanism of BDNF. So we also know that people with depression, with acute depression, they have high cortisol, but chronic depression, they have low cortisol. What we see here is that the normalization of cortisol, and here the normalization of BDNF. I was changing the two images, but here I can see that cortisol levels are increased to normal levels, and here you see that BDNF are also increased to control levels compared with normal volunteers. And in both cases, these biological measures were correlated with symptom improvement. Preclinically, we do not have showed that yet in humans, but we know that ayahuasca compounds, both beta-carbolines and DMT, can increase neurogenesis. We see here work performed by Brazilian scientists showing that in Spanish science that all compounds present in ayahuasca can increase the proliferation of human neuroprogenitors and including neurogenesis. We know today in pharmacology and psychiatry, increased neurogenesis is not always good, but the hope with this kind of trial is maybe that ayahuasca has already been taught with LSD and psilocybin can be used in neurodegenerative neuropsychiatric disorders, for example, like Alzheimer's disease. Including, I know that people are already planning some clinical trials with LSD for older people to see if it increases somehow neuroplasticity. We also know that some of these compounds and some approved antidepressants, they have anti-inflammatory effects. There is one of the possible explanations of depression and other neuropsychiatric disorders is increased central inflammation. So in the same study with depression and ayahuasca in Brazil, we found that 22 days after ayahuasca intake, it reduced pro-inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. And again, this biological effect was correlated with clinical improvement. So we saw modulation of cortisol, modulation of BDNF, and modulation of inflammatory markers, all showing correlation with possible symptom improvement. Some similar results were also observed in ketamine. We were the first group to show that psychedelic compounds can modulate the endocannabinoid system. We are the laboratory where I work here in Brazil is one of the main producers of scientific knowledge in cannabidiol research. We have been investigating cannabidiol in the last 30 or 40 years in the University of São Paulo. And because of that, we already have some experience investigating the endocannabinoid system. And we have shown for the first time that after a single ayahuasca use in patients in that trial with social anxiety disorder, it could increase anandamide levels in anxiety disorder. So somehow these drugs do not only modulate serotonergic pathways, but also the endocannabinoid system. And this is a very small trial, and we would need to do that in a bigger sample to replicate those findings. This is one of the most difficult questions to answer today is the psychoactive or psychedelic experience necessary for the therapeutic effect? Because if these drugs are increasing neurons, synapses in rats or in neurons, do we need the subjective experience? The truth is that we do not know. Could be these antidepressant effects only a biological effect? Increase neuroplasticity? Maybe. So we still do not know how or if this subjective experience is necessary for the therapeutic effects. There are some studies showing correlation, for example, in studies with psilocybin and cancer patients. They show that the more common what they call a mystic experience, kind of experience where you cannot explain it to words, when everything makes sense, and you are less anxious, with less fear of death, for example. The more intense the experience, the better the improvement in depression anxiety, for example. So some evidence show that, others not. With ayahuasca, we show here, for example, this is the HRS, the hallucinogen rating scale, showing that although there were increases in this scale, showing psychoactivity or psychedelic effects, there are no correlations between those effects and depression improvement. So are these effects necessary? We still do not know. In fact, there are some organic chemistry trying to design drugs that can increase neuroplasticity as these drugs do, but they do not have psychedelic effects. So I was talking about the mystic experience. It's a very curious area of investigation that somehow our brains are wired to experience religions, feelings, and emotions. People can induce that by chanting, going to the church, and sometimes by using some drugs or all of these things together, like in the ayahuasca ritual, for example. And this experience is characterized by this ineffability, the incapacity to describe this in words, transcendence of time and space, positive mood. People sometimes say the opposites are seen as not opposite anymore. And somehow this experience seems to be related, not always, with the clinical improvement in this patient. So in the same study of ayahuasca, we have shown that one of the subscales of the MAC, discretionary, transcendence of time and space, was negatively related with depressive symptoms. This means that the higher these effects in transcendence of time and space, the lower the symptoms. So somehow we believe here in our research group that this subjective experience matter to the whole therapeutic experience. Another very interesting area is personality. Usually, personalities thought are something more stable over the lifetime of individual, but some studies say that very emotionally intense experience, like the death of a son or daughter, the marriage or the first son or daughter, can have an impact in the personality. And somehow, psychedelic drugs also seem to do that. We have some study with psilocybin and LSD showing that acute experience of these drugs seem to increase openness, this trait openness to experience is related to, for example, increase aesthetic appreciation of nature, art, music, openness to new ideas, new conceptions, new political views. And we also showed that with ayahuasca. In healthy volunteers, we also showed that a single dose of ayahuasca increases this trait of personality. And now we are assessing that in some clinical samples. For example, we know that in major depressive disorder, there is increased neuroticism. There is a study with psilocybin, for example, that showed that patients with depression after psilocybin had less neuroticism. So we are trying to show that with ayahuasca too, but not only in depression, but also, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder and drug abuse too. And another area that we are investigating in the University of São Paulo is social cognition. Social cognition is the ability that we humans have, for example, to recognize that someone is happy or sad or with fear, but without using words, just by face recognition, for example, or voice recognition, or body movements. Another aspect of social cognition is empathy, how much you can empathize with someone suffering, for example. These are very human characteristics and very important socially, because with that we can relate with each other. And we know today that some psychiatric disorders like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use, they are associated with deficits in social cognition. For example, people with depression, if you do a face recognition test, they recognize neutral faces as sad faces or happy as neutral. So they have what we call a negative bias towards face recognition. And we also know that the traditional antidepressant drugs, they reverse these cognitive deficits. So we also are trying to see if ayahuasca and other psychedelics do that. So in some of our studies, we saw that although this ayahuasca, and this happened also with psilocybin and LSD, did not increase accuracy. This means people were more correct in guessing which face was reporting each emotion, but they were faster doing that. So somehow emotional processing was faster for them. And we know, for example, that depression, people are lower in these tests. So maybe there is a psilocybin study that showed that patients after psilocybin increased the reaction times and were more similar with controls in this test, for example. And we also saw, this was also showed that with psilocybin LSD, increased reaction time, the empathy test, we did not observe increased empathy here with ayahuasca, but it's what was already showed with LSD and psilocybin. So we also know that some of these disorders are characterized by low empathy. So we are trying to see if this is a possible mechanism of the therapeutic effects of these substances. And going to the final part of the talk, we talk about where we do our research. It's some two concepts are very important in the research with psychedelics: set and setting. This set, it relates to the person who's going there, their expectations, the personality, it's healthy, it's with a psychiatric disorder, what information these people bring to the laboratory about the drug they're going to take. Have you ever heard about these drugs or not? And setting is where the experiment or the session takes place. So who is with this patient or healthy volunteer? What happens there? Is there silence? Is there music? Is 1, 2, or 3 people inside? There is psychotherapy before or after this is another area that I did not prolong, but it's also another question. Is psychotherapy necessary to use with these drugs? Does psychotherapy increases their therapeutic effects? What kind of psychotherapy should be used with these drugs? We do not know the answer, to any of those questions yet. We in Brazil here, we do our research without any psychotherapy. We do with psychological support to enhance safety, but we do not apply any specific technique of psychotherapy. We do that on purpose because several reasons, including psychotherapy enhances the price of this treatment if it today becomes a treatment. For example, people in Brazil are not very aching to psychotherapy. People in Brazil, they are afraid of saying that they go to a psychiatrist to take medication. People have prejudice to that. So we are not a very engaged society in psychotherapy. Only the richer are. So are you going to plan a treatment that's only accessible to the richer? We cannot replicate also the setting that happened, for example, in the United States. We have some research like the John Hopkins group that's very focused, for example, in mystical experience. They use a playlist which composed of neo-shamanic, instrumental, orientalist music, which also creates a specific setting for those individuals going there. And it's very, for example, different from Brazil. We do not use music here, but if someone wants to go to a Santo Daime ritual, they can go. So we're trying to figure out a setting that's more a Brazilian setting, right? So it's a very clean setting. This is the laboratory. I am here in the photograph. People are safe. This is like a hotel room. They have a bathroom, a private bathroom here. Usually only 2, at most 3 researchers are with the person inside this room. If they have to apply a specific computer test, as you can see there are a face recognition test, but this is a very clear room. If you see the same environment in other research groups, they use like flowers and carpet with geometric patterns, so Buddhist statues. So these change the setting. So, for example, it's very curious that we do not observe here spontaneously people reporting mystical or religion experiences. They do not report that. Maybe because the setting does not facilitate that. So depending on what you want or the kind of design, you have a specific setting. So our setting, this is in a very huge psychiatric hospital, and we think that in a Brazilian cultural way. I mean, if this someday becomes a treatment, we should be thinking about here in this case in Brazilians that probably will have to be in an environment like this, that won't have resources to pay to more researchers in the room and music and more hours like psychotherapy. So it's very culture oriented what we do here. This is our hospital. We are here. This is a very huge university where we work at. We are here in the 3rd floor of this 12th floor building. And those are our main researchers in our team. We have Professor Jaime Alac and Professor Flávio Osorio, psychiatrists and psychologists. They are professors like me, Professor Bolson from Spain and Janice that work with him in Nice Years Foundation, and our students that are doing PhDs or master theses here with mainly ayahuasca, but we also work today with ibogaine. Something that is very peculiar to Brazil is that every student here has his own project. When you come to our group, you probably develop your own clinical trial or experimental trial and have volunteers. And also what's very common in Brazil is that all the resources are public. We can see here that all the resources that we use in Brazil are from the government. We do not do ayahuasca work associated with pharmaceutical groups and not private donations. So while in some countries, for example, in the US, only now the study with government funding are starting. We are doing ayahuasca research here for more than 20 years with government research resources. So this is what I wanted to talk with you. I hope you have enjoyed, and I'm here to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We do have a lot of questions, one of which has been answered with regards to the setting. But I think that what you were also saying is that, so for your clinical trials, it's a minimalist setting, and you seem to notice that visual cues have some effects in terms of the experiences of our participants.
Do you want
Okay.
me to comment on that, or is already answered?
Would you like to add comments, or you're good?
No, just because it's maybe what people hear more about ayahuasca is about the ritual aspect. You go there, you have music, you have dancing, and sometimes you have even other therapeutic elements in these retreats, massages, other plants, psychotherapy. So what I want to make clear is what we do in the lab is different, and we do that on purpose. Here in Brazil, for example, I cannot use the songs for Santo Daime in the lab. It's like a copyright. We cannot include traditional elements in the setting because these elements are protected by law. So we have to make very clear what we do here is science and not religion or ritual. We have our own ritual, but it's scientific ritual.
Scientific rituals. Yes. Thank you
Yes.
so much, sir. There is a question from Miss Mariama asking, are there longitudinal studies showing long-term effects of ayahuasca?
About long-term effects, in our clinical trials, we usually follow up patients 2, 3, sometimes 6 months. But we, at the moment, we only gave them single doses.
Oh.
In this study with depression is the first one that we're giving them 4 doses, and the results are not yet published, but we follow them for 3 months. For longer periods, we must rely on observational studies. Several of the observational studies that I have shown evaluated the mental health of users, like 10, 15, or 20 years of continuous ritual use of ayahuasca. Most of the studies do not find harm in these individuals, but one important thing to mention is that they are observational studies, thus we cannot infer causality. For example, we do not know if the samples are self-selected. Someone in the way may had a psychotic break and went out and is not in this 20-year sample. So although the long-term data show that apparently not harmful, we still have to look with the data with caution.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And you did mention that for your clinical trials, you do select people without not genetic who are not reporting any forms of mental illnesses, right? At the moment. So I think that's a very important thing. But maybe in the long run, we will be able to have these studies available for us with regards to the long-term effects. So the other question, sir, is from Dr. Staniksai. Are there medicines to counteract the toxicity in case of overdose? Or are there even overdoses reported from ayahuasca?
Good question. For psychedelics in general, and I'm talking here classic psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, and LSD. Most important side effects are psychological. A very panic reaction, psychotic reaction. But ayahuasca is different because of the MAOIs, the substances in the liana, the harmine, etc. They can interact with, for example, antidepressants. So then you could have an intoxication or something like that, or interact with other drugs, which is something that psilocybin LSD has a lower risk. So depending on the effect, we will have a different treatment. For anxiety, normally psychiatric use benzodiazepines. For psychotic symptoms that do not subside, maybe associate an antipsychotic drug. But other instance of intoxication is very difficult because we do not observe them. It's difficult. We do not see them. For example, in clinical trials, people vomit or have nausea, but it's very time limited. We do not give medication to them. Only never happened, but it was too intense. We could have antiemetic drugs, but we never had to use them. But in these intoxications that I mentioned, death cases, we have very little information about the patient, what was this ayahuasca and how was this managed in the hospital where these people went. So we do not have much information on that. So again, it's a plant, but can have some effects that we still do not know. So we are very careful selecting patients, not face these effects, these possible effects.
Okay, thank you so much. There's another question with regards to the social prejudice in the use of ayahuasca. So, do you guys see that in Brazil?
Yeah, it's a very good question because some researcher did some online questions about that to doctors, psychedelic users, because, for example, LSD and psilocybin are usually associated with recreational drugs. The hippies and people are sometimes afraid of using them. Now the society is changing for these drugs, but traditionally they are think as recreational drugs. Ayahuasca was never recreational. So people here in Brazil, they usually respect ayahuasca. They, oh, something from the indigenous groups, something from the Amazon. Let's not touch that. Let's respect that. So people respect ayahuasca. They do not. They fear, but it's a fear, a respectful fear. They do not associate it with MDMA or other recreational drugs. But that's a very, I think, South American perspective. Although there are some observational studies showing that both Europeans and North Americans, they usually use ayahuasca in ritual settings. It's very different from using sometimes LSD or psilocybin in a party or recreational contests. But when they do ayahuasca, they go to a ritual. So I think ayahuasca still has this respectful image for both researchers and users.
So thank you for that. I actually have a personal follow-up on that because I'm based in the USA right now and I do see advertisements, commercials promoting ayahuasca and like recruiting people in what you mentioned, like a retreat like events. So I was wondering, are there measures in place to protect the indigenous group who's using it for spiritual purposes? Or like is ayahuasca something that can easily be accessed in your region, like for someone who's trying to create an event out of it? And I feel that it's a little bit exploitation, but that's me. So
No, it's a very good question. For in Brazil, if you come, any of you come here in Brazil today, you could go to an ayahuasca ritual because they are present in all Brazilian states. For example, here where I am, maybe there are 10 ayahuasca groups in 100 kilometers from here. So it's not everybody who goes, it's a minority, but you can go. We are now more and more seeing instance, as you told me, commercialization in the Instagram, people saying that ayahuasca produces miracles. There's also agora this microdose hype. There's also people selling microdose of ayahuasca. We do not know what's that and what does it do, but the indigenous groups are protected by law. Well, you asked that. So the rituals, what they use ayahuasca is, Brazil has a very specific law for indigenous groups. So they are not in the same place. But we see today, as I told you, especially in Peru, this blend of indigenous foreigners that are selling these retreats. I'm a very critic about this. I think it has some dangers because sometimes in these places, not in the US, I'm talking about South America, people are socially, economically disadvantaged, people are poor, they see a possibility of have some money because they're giving people with euros and dollars. In Peru, we know that people have these big propagandas to sell ayahuasca. So I think this is not good. I think this is something that in the long run, I think will cause more problem than solutions, because if you have someone unprepared to deal with some of these effects, you can have more harm. So in the US, also, we are watching very carefully this state for example, Colorado, and now allow some psilocybin mushrooms, and maybe you do not need to be a doctor, and people can access it more easily. And we are starting to see, for example, some increases in psychotic episodes associated with these substances. So I think there is, as with the cannabinoids also, I think there is a hype. This word is now everywhere. We see documentaries in Netflix saying how these drugs are wonderful and how they will change your life with a single experience. And we know by experience that not the truth for most people. So yes, I think there is possibility for harm. I think things like we're doing here is the best thing that we can do, is spread good information about the substance that you can spread over and over. And as for the indigenous groups, we have protection, but for this other instance, we do not have a legislation. If someone wants to buy ayahuasca in the internet here in Brazil and start doing rituals in the back of his house, we do not have fiscalizations for that. We know that's rare, but sometimes it happens, and we deal that with information, education, and that's what we try to do.
Thank you so much. Sir, there's another question from Ms. Araceli about your clinical trial. Do you make the ayahuasca brew, or is it or do you get it already prepared? Do you have your own medicine?
No, we do not prepare ayahuasca, exactly because we respect the traditional knowledge. There is a very specific laws in Brazil. If you access traditional knowledge, you have to document it. So ayahuasca is traditional knowledge. We did not invent it. So these religious groups, they give us ayahuasca for free to do research. Though we receive ayahuasca from Santo Daime, from Barquinha, from Deville. What we do is that when ayahuasca comes here, we start to analyze the compounds and to see how much DMT and harmine is there. And we also do stability studies. When an ayahuasca batch comes to our lab, we follow it until its end, and then there's another batch. But it's very difficult to work with plants because they are living beings. So every ayahuasca is different in chemical profile. But what we do is that we do a study with a single batch, and we always monitoring the alkaloids there.
Okay. So I actually have a sort of follow-up question for that, but I think you sort of like answered that we still don't know. Because like I was wondering if we have established the duration for the psychedelic or the mystic effect of ayahuasca vis-a-vis its dose. But it seems that, like how long does the effect last based on the dosage? Like, do we have information regarding its half-life at the moment, or it's still something that's being worked upon?
Yes, it's being worked upon, but we have some information. So for example, the whole experience usually lasts between 4 and 6 hours. It's more like psilocybin, the time even shorter sometimes. We know that of the four main alkaloids, DMT, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine, you only find tetrahydroharmine after 24 hours. Before 24 hours, all alkaloids are already absent of blood analysis and urine analysis that we do. It's very fast, the half-life, because also it's very interesting. I did not mention that, but we all have DMT in our bodies. DMT is endogenous, so its metabolism is also very fast, so it's prolonged by the malaction. After malaction, there's DMT rapidly metabolized. So with a single dose, before 24 hours, most of the substance are already metabolized.
So thank you very much. I think I end with the last question for the day. So we would like to express our sincerest appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Dos Santos, for an excellent presentation. And of course, our very capable interpreter, Mr. Arroyo. Let us give them a big hand. So we thank you for being here. And to our dearest participant, thank you for your engagement. Please visit www.icuddr.org to know more about our future events. We do have monthly webinars that's available for you. And this Demystifying Ayahuasca is the first in our psychopharmacology series. So thank you once again, and I wish everyone a good day. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
sir.